Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Black and Blue Crime.
Black and Blue Crime.
At 6:04 a.m. on November 18th, 2009, a woman's voice crackled through the emergency dispatch system in Vermilion, Ohio. "Somebody shot my husband. I need help. Please listen to me." The desperation in Julene Simcoe's voice seemed genuine, raw, the kind of terror that can't be faked. Or so it appeared. When patrol units arrived at the isolated property overlooking Lake Erie minutes later, they discovered 36-year-old Jeremy Simcoe sprawled motionless in his bed, a single bullet wound to the back of his skull. His wife, 31-year-old Julene, was the sole survivor of what looked like a targeted execution. She claimed she'd woken to an unfamiliar sound, grabbed her pistol from the nightstand, fired 2 warning shots down the hallway at a shadowy figure, and then found her husband of 10 years bleeding out beside her. The scene was chaos incarnate. A knocked-over chair in the kitchen, a .357 Magnum resting on the counter, a purse stuffed with cash, suggesting a robbery, and, perhaps most bizarrely, 5 guard dogs tied up in the backyard. Black gloves lay discarded near the property line. Unidentified footprints marked the perimeter. Everything screamed professional hit, a cold-blooded intruder who'd come to kill and vanished like smoke. But then the contradictions started appearing, small cracks in an otherwise convincing facade. Jeremy and Julene weren't just cautious people, they were obsessively security-minded, the kind of couple who installed comprehensive alarm systems and kept multiple guard dogs precisely to prevent what had supposedly just happened. Yet when investigators examined the system, they found no evidence of tampering, no signs it had been triggered. The doors showed no forced entry, the windows were secure, and perhaps most damning of all, forensic teams swept the entire house and found absolutely zero foreign DNA. Not a hair, not a skin cell, not a single trace of an outsider's presence. The locked room mystery was complete. Someone had murdered Jeremy Simcoe in a house that appeared hermetically sealed from the outside world. Detectives chased every lead that crossed their desks. A strange figure spotted lurking near the property days earlier, a neighbor who possessed a spare key, a contractor who'd recently threatened Jeremy over a payment dispute, heated words exchanged about money owed. Each lead dissolved into nothing, every suspect cleared, every theory collapsing under scrutiny. The case went cold, the file growing dusty in an evidence room, while Jeremy's family grieved and Julene tried to rebuild her shattered life. But the family couldn't let it go, couldn't accept that their son and brother's killer would never face justice. The tension between them and Julene grew toxic, especially when she announced plans to sell the house they'd shared. To Jeremy's relatives, it felt like erasure, like burying his memory along with the crime. 4 years of silence followed. 4 years where the public believed the investigation had stalled completely. What they didn't know was that detectives had never stopped working, never abandoned the case. They'd been reviewing every shred of evidence, re-examining witness statements, looking for the detail everyone had missed. In November 2013, they finally found it. Julene received a call requesting another interview, this time with her attorney present. She walked into that interrogation room believing she'd simply recount the same story she'd told dozens of times before. The evening spent canning pumpkins with Jeremy, the routine of bedtime, the terrifying noise that jolted her awake, the desperate grab for her 9mm pistol, the 2 shots fired into darkness, and the horrifying discovery of Jeremy's wound. She'd pulled him from the bed following the 911 operator's instructions, or at least she thought she had. The memories were hazy, she explained, trauma having eaten away at the specifics.
The detectives listened patiently, then began probing the inconsistencies. Small things at first, almost trivial.
Julene claimed her gun had been in the dresser, but forensic analysis showed no blood spatter on the weapon, despite her insistence that she'd cradled Jeremy's blood-soaked body. She couldn't explain why the chains on the guard dogs were extended to unusual lengths that night, or why animals trained to bark at strangers had remained eerily silent. Then came the bigger problem, the back door. Julene insisted Jeremy had locked it before bed, their nightly ritual. But when investigators processed the door, they found something impossible. Not a single trace of Jeremy's DNA or fingerprints on the lock. The door had been secured after his death, locked by someone who wasn't him. The investigators shifted tactics, peeling back layers of the Simcoe's marriage to reveal something darker than anyone had imagined. Friends and family described Jeremy as volatile, a man with a hair-triggered temper who'd verbally abuse contractors and employees without hesitation. There were whispers of animal cruelty in his past. Julene wasn't much better, according to those who knew her. Manipulative, aggressive, someone who'd allegedly orchestrated confrontations between romantic partners for sport. She admitted Jeremy had struck her once early in their relationship, a blow she'd immediately returned, establishing what she claimed was a mutual understanding that physical violence wouldn't be tolerated. But the real revelation came from the couple's seized computer equipment. Buried in their personal files, investigators discovered a 14-page handwritten document titled Master-Slave Father-Daughter Agreement. It was a contract detailing an elaborate role-play scenario that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Julene's background included severe childhood sexual abuse at the hands of her own father, a trauma that cast the document in a deeply disturbing light. When confronted, Julene insisted the activities were consensual, that she'd worked through her past in therapy years ago, that none of it mattered anymore. But the detectives had one more piece of evidence, something pulled from the computer's search history that changed everything. 11 hours before Jeremy was shot, someone had searched for Julene's father's obituary. 11 hours. The timing was too precise, too coincidental to ignore. It suggested a psychological trigger, a moment where past trauma and present reality collided with explosive force. Julene denied making the search, claimed she had no idea how it appeared in their browser history. The investigators pressed harder, walking her through the impossibility of her intruder theory. This phantom killer would have needed to bypass motion sensor driveway alarms, door chimes, and 5 trained guard dogs without triggering a single alert. They would have needed to enter a house without forced entry, navigate unfamiliar rooms in darkness, locate a specific .357 Magnum stored in a curio cabinet that bore only Julene's DNA, execute a perfect point-blank shot, meticulously clean all blowback and forensic evidence from the weapon, and escape unseen while Julene was supposedly awake and alert on the 3rd floor. The statistical probability wasn't just low, it was effectively 0. But Julene had an answer for everything. The area wasn't as safe as people thought. There had been another break-in, hadn't there? In fact, she'd called the police the very morning after Jeremy's death to report that their surveillance system had been stolen, along with $2,000 in cash. The safe had been tampered with, she claimed, showing investigators damage to the hinges. A contractor later examined the safe and told police the damage appeared staged, finding only the tip of a fire poker wedged into the mechanism, completely the wrong tool for forcing that particular model.
Julene had bagged the poker tip, promising to deliver it as evidence, but it never materialized. Another fabrication layered atop the original lie. The investigators laid out 3 coincidences that demolished any remaining pretense of innocence. First, Jeremy had taken sleeping medication that night, something he rarely did, and forensic tests showed Benadryl in his system. Second, Julene, who typically slept beside her husband, had chosen that particular night to sleep upstairs on a different floor. Third, the murder weapon had been moved from Jeremy's side of the bed to Julene's nightstand. And then came the final revelation, the one Julene couldn't talk her way around. A nurse in the emergency room that morning remembered something strange. When asked what had happened, the nurse could have sworn Julene said, "I shot my husband." Only when questioned again did Julene quickly correct herself to, "My husband was shot." A slip of the tongue, perhaps, or an inadvertent confession caught in a moment of shock and exhaustion. Julene denied it vehemently, but the accumulation of evidence had become an avalanche. Professional analysts studied the 911 recording, identifying 10 markers consistent with a guilty caller and only 4 markers of innocence. They noted that while Julene claimed to be performing CPR, the audio patterns indicated she was sitting motionless beside the body, not actively compressing Jeremy's chest. A friend later recalled a chilling conversation where Julene mused aloud, "Do you think Jeremy knows who shot him?" When pressed, she'd responded cryptically, "Yeah, he knows," and refused to elaborate further. On December 19, 2014, 5 years after that early morning 911 call, prosecutors filed formal charges against Julene Simcoe, aggravated murder and tampering with evidence. The state's theory coalesced around 2 motives working in tandem. First, financial desperation. Julene stood to collect $6,000 in life insurance, money she desperately needed to cover mounting debts. Second, and perhaps more compelling, was the psychological escape theory. The marriage had become a prison, a recreation of the abusive dynamics she'd endured as a child, with Jeremy playing the role her father once occupied. That computer search for her father's obituary wasn't random. It was a psychological break, a moment where past and present fused, and something inside Julene snapped. She chose a bench trial, placing her fate entirely in the hands of a single judge rather than a jury of peers. The prosecution built their case methodically, brick by brick. The secure house with no signs of intrusion, the absence of foreign DNA, the murder weapon wiped clean while still bearing Julene's genetic material on the cabinet where it was stored, the staged secondary break-in, the locked back door missing Jeremy's fingerprints, the suspicious computer search hours before the killing, the slip in the emergency room, the calculated performance on the 911 call. The defense offered no testimony from Julene herself, no witnesses to counter the state's narrative, nothing to challenge the mounting wall of circumstantial evidence. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any defense. On October 20th, 2017, nearly 8 years after Jeremy Simcoe took his last breath, the judge delivered his verdict in a courtroom packed with both families. The court finds that there was sufficient evidence to establish proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Mrs. Simcoe was her husband's murderer. The gavel fell. Julene Simcoe received a sentence of 28 years in prison, the end of her 5-year period of freedom and the beginning of a much longer period of confinement. For Jeremy's family, it was closure of a sort, an acknowledgement that justice, however delayed, had finally caught up with the truth. The perfect murder had never existed, only a carefully constructed lie that couldn't withstand the weight of its own contradictions. In the end, it wasn't a phantom intruder who took Jeremy Simcoe's life in that quiet house overlooking Lake Erie. It was the woman sleeping under the same roof, the person who knew every alarm code, every security measure, every dog's temperament, every locked door and hidden weapon, the person who stood to gain from his death and had every reason to want him gone, the person who made one critical mistake after another in trying to sell an impossible story. And when investigators finally assembled all the pieces, the picture became undeniable. There was no mystery, no unsolved crime, just a calculated act of violence, followed by years of deflection, denial, and a desperate hope that the truth would stay buried. It didn't.